The wind came first, arriving before the sun had even thought to crest the jagged teeth of the eastern mountains. It was a dry, hollow thing, a breath that stripped the moisture from the soil and the hope from a man's chest. Daniel Hayes lay in the center of his bed, the mattress sagging on the left side where his weight had rested for 10 years, while the right side remained flat and cold. A pristine memorial to a woman who had been in the ground for 2 winters. The house groaned. The timber, warped by the relentless Arizona sun and the freezing high desert nights, complained under the assault of the gale. Daniel stared up at the ceiling beams, counting the knots in the wood as he had done every morning since Sarah passed. 1, 2, 3. The third one looked like a weeping eye. He threw off the heavy quilt, the air in the room biting at his skin. It was November in the territory, the year 1878, and the mornings had grown teeth. He dressed in the dark. His trousers were stiff with the previous day's sweat and dirt, his shirt missing a button near the collar that he lacked the skill or the will to sew back on. In the kitchen, he lit the stove with mechanical efficiency, the movements practiced until they required no thought. Coffee, black, thick, and bitter enough to wake the dead, though it never woke the one person he wanted to see. Stepping out onto the porch, Daniel surveyed the 160 acres that made up his world. It was a kingdom of dust. The irrigation ditch he had dug by hand 3 years ago was low, a muddy vein struggling to feed the last of the winter wheat. To the south, the Dragoon Mountains rose like purple bruises against the lightening sky. It was beautiful land, terrified and terrifying. A place that demanded payment in blood and sweat for every inch of life it sustained. He was 34 years old, but the mirror over the wash basin showed a man of 50. His eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were washed out, crinkled at the corners from squinting against the glare. His beard was trimmed close, not out of vanity, but because a long beard caught the dust and the smell of the horses. The day passed as all days did. He mended a section of the corral fence where the wood had rotted through. He checked the hooves of his 2 remaining plow horses, ancient beasts with spines that swayed like old rope bridges. He walked the perimeter of his fields, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. A man did not walk unarmed in this country. The law was a distant concept, written on paper in Tucson or Prescott. But out here, the law was the weight of lead and the speed of a hand. Desperate men roamed these flats. Drifters displaced by the war back east, men with hollow eyes and nothing to lose, who would cut a throat for a pair of boots or a sack of flour. Daniel had chased off 2 such groups in the last 6 months. He had not fired his weapon, but the look in his eyes, dead and flat as the hard pan, had sent them moving on. It was near dusk when the rhythm of his solitude broke. He was near the barn, forking hay into the stalls. When the horses shifted uneasily, they stomped, their ears swiveling toward the darkening sagebrush beyond the fence line. Daniel stopped. He let the pitchfork rest against his shoulder and listened. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so profound it hummed in the ears. He stepped out of the barn, his hand drifting naturally to the Colt Navy revolver holstered at his hip. She was sitting in the shadow of the water trough. At first, he thought it was a trick of the fading light, a pile of rags blown against the wood. But then the rags moved. A head lifted. Daniel drew the pistol, leveling it but not cocking the hammer. "Stand up," he commanded, his voice raspy from a day of disuse. The figure rose slowly, unfolding with a fluid, eerie grace that belonged to no white settler. She was small, but her posture was as straight as a rifle barrel. She wore a dress of buckskin and trade cloth, stained with the red dust of the road, the hem tattered and dragging. Her hair was black, thick and matted, hanging loose around a face that was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut the air. She was Apache. Daniel felt a cold spike of adrenaline in his gut. The stories of the wars, of the raids that left ranches burning and families butchered, were the lullabies of the territory. Fear, sharp and bright, told him to fire, to run, to shout, but he did not fire. He looked at her hands. They were empty. He looked at her eyes. They were not filled with the fury of a warrior, but with an exhaustion so deep it looked like death. "Water," she said. The word was a dry croak, barely English. Daniel lowered the gun an inch. "You are alone?" She nodded once. He scanned the horizon behind her. The brush was still. No dust clouds marked the approach of riders. No birds took flight in alarm. She was a ghost, materialized out of nothingness. "There is a dipper by the pump," he said, gesturing with his chin. She moved to the pump. She did not rush, even in her thirst. She possessed a dignity that made Daniel feel suddenly clumsy in his own yard. She worked the handle, caught the water in the tin dipper, and drank. She drank until he thought she might burst, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Food," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of need. "I have little," Daniel said. His guard still up. "The winter will be hard." "I work," she replied. Her voice was stronger now that the dust was washed from her throat. "I work. Eat." Daniel looked at her hands again. They were calloused, scarred, the hands of someone who knew the texture of labor. He looked at the barn, where the work was piling up faster than one man could manage. He looked at the empty house, where the silence waited to swallow him whole for another night. He holstered the gun. "There is stew on the stove." He said, "You can sleep in the barn. There are blankets in the tack room. If you steal anything, even a nail, I will track you down." She did not flinch at the threat. She simply nodded, her dark eyes fixing on his face for a moment before she turned toward the house. That was how Nayland entered his life. Not with a fanfare, but with the quiet desperation of a starving animal seeking shelter from the wind. The first week passed in a strange, silent tension. Daniel expected her to vanish in the night, taking a horse or a knife with her. Every morning, he woke before dawn, checking the yard from his window. But every morning, she was there. She worked with a ferocity that unsettled him. She did not wait for instruction. She saw what was broken and she fixed it. She saw what was dirty and she cleaned it. She hauled water from the well, her arms straining under the weight of the buckets, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She chopped kindling, the axe rising and falling with a rhythmic thud that echoed off the barn walls. She never approached the main house unless called. She slept in the hayloft, wrapping herself in the wool blankets he had provided. She ate the food he brought out to her, beans, cornbread, tough venison stew, sitting on an overturned crate by the tack room door. Daniel watched her. He could not help it. He would pause in the field, leaning on his hoe, and watch the way she moved around the corral. She was apart from this world, alien to his understanding of how a woman should be. Sarah had been soft, round in places, filled with laughter and the smell of lavender water. This woman had hard angles and silence. She smelled of wood smoke and sage. Yet there was a familiarity in her eyes. He recognized the look. It was the look of someone who had stood at a grave and realized that the world did not stop spinning just because your heart had stopped beating. He did not know her name until the 4th day. He had brought her a plate of biscuits and bacon in the morning. "What do I call you?" he asked. She looked up from the harness she was oiling. "Nalin, Nalin," he repeated. It felt strange in his mouth, a sound made of wind and earth. "I am Daniel." She did not repeat his name. She simply went back to the harness, her fingers working the oil into the cracked leather. The memories came to Nalin in the quiet hours, when the moon was high and the coyotes sang their lonely songs to the stars. She would lie in the scratchy hay, staring into the darkness, and the past would bleed into the present. She remembered the heat of the reservation, a flat, scorched piece of land where the government had herded her people like cattle. The San Carlos Agency. They called it a reservation. She called it a graveyard. She remembered the dust that never settled, coating the inside of her throat, the inside of her soul. She remembered the rations, flour filled with weevils, beef that was green with rot. She remembered the eyes of the soldiers, blue and cold, watching them with a mixture of disgust and fear. But mostly, she remembered the heat of her son's skin. He was 4 years old. His name was hidden in her heart, too sacred to speak aloud in this white man's barn. The sickness had come with the winter rains. It started with a cough, a dry hacking sound that rattled his small chest. Then the fever. She had begged the agent for medicine. She had offered to scrub floors, to haul rocks, to do anything. The agent had looked at her through the wire mesh of his window and shook his head. "Supplies are low," he had said. "We have to prioritize." Prioritize. A white word for letting an Apache child burn up with fever. She had held him as he died. She had rocked him back and forth, humming the songs of her grandmother, trying to pour her own life into his failing body. When he took his last breath, a small, shuddering sigh that seemed too quiet for such a terrible moment. Something inside Nayland had shattered. They tried to bury him in the mass plot, a trench dug for the many who were dying. She refused. She fought them with her nails and her teeth until they struck her down with the butt of a rifle. When she woke, he was gone, buried in the anonymous earth. That night, she had cut her hair short in mourning. That night, she had slipped through the wire, moving like the shadow of a hawk. She had no destination. She only knew she could not stay in the place that had eaten her child. She walked for days, eating lizards and roots, drinking from muddy cattle tanks, until her legs failed her at the edge of Daniel Hayes's farm. She stayed because his eyes were not like the soldier's eyes. There was no hate in them. There was only a vast, echoing emptiness that matched her own. On the 10th evening, the air grew heavy and still. The sky to the west turned a bruised purple, clouds piling atop one another like mountains of slate. The smell of creosote bush, sharp and medicinal, rose from the desert floor. A storm was coming. Daniel cooked a rabbit he had snared earlier that day. He made a stew, thick with potatoes and onions he had managed to coax from the dry garden. When he carried the bowl out to the barn, the wind was picking up again, whipping the dust into dancing devils. Nayland was sitting on her crate, staring at the darkening sky. She did not look at him as he approached. "Eat," Daniel said, holding out the bowl. She took it. The heat of the ceramic warmed her hands. "Thank you." Daniel hesitated. The wind gusted, chilling the sweat on his neck. "You should eat inside tonight," he said. "The storm will be bad." She shook her head. "I am fine here." It wasn't a refusal of comfort. It was a refusal to intrude. She knew her place in this world. She was the Apache woman. He was the white settler. There were lines drawn in blood between them that could not be crossed by a simple invitation to dinner. Daniel did not press her. He sat down on the chopping block opposite her, his own bowl in his hands. He ate in silence, watching the lightning flash in the distance, illuminating the jagged peaks of the dragoons. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the scrape of spoons and the rising moan of the wind. Then, Daniel looked up and found her watching him. Her gaze was intense, unblinking, stripping away the layers of defense he wore like armor. He stopped eating. "What is it?" She lowered her spoon. "Why do you look at me like that?" Her voice was soft, barely audible over the wind, but the question hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was the first time she had asked him anything personal. The first time she had acknowledged the strange, silent dance they had been performing. "Like what?" Daniel asked, his throat suddenly tight. "Like I am a ghost," she said. "Or like you are trying to remember a song you forgot." Daniel looked down at his boots. The leather was cracked and worn, covered in the dust of the fields. She was perceptive, more than he wanted her to be. "You remind me of someone," he admitted, the words feeling dangerous. "Your wife?" "Yes and no." He looked up, meeting her eyes. She was light. "You are." "Dark," she supplied. No bitterness in the tone, just truth. "Quiet," he corrected. "You are quiet in the same way the house is quiet now." Nayland considered this. She took another bite of the stew, chewing slowly. "Silence is a shield," she said. "Words can be used as weapons. Silence cannot be twisted." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is true enough." A crack of thunder split the sky, loud as a cannon shot. The horses in the barn whinnied in panic, their hooves thumping against the wooden stalls. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry earth with a sound like gravel being thrown. "The horses!" Daniel said, standing up quickly. Naylin was already moving. She set her bowl down and followed him into the barn. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of hay, manure, and horse sweat. The lantern hanging from the center beam cast long, swinging shadows as the wind rattled the roof. The two plow horses, Buster and Blue, were rolling their eyes, pulling at their lead ropes. "Easy, boys. Easy now," Daniel soothed, moving to Blue's head. He stroked the animal's velvet nose, murmuring low, meaningless words. Naylin went to Buster. She did not speak. She simply laid her hand on the horse's neck and breathed out. A long, slow exhalation. The horse mimicked her, his tension draining away into the straw. The storm broke fully overhead. The rain hammered against the roof, a deafening roar that isolated them from the rest of the world. The barn became a capsule, a tiny vessel of light and warmth in a sea of chaotic darkness. Daniel finished checking Blue's hooves and turned. Naylin was standing only a few feet away, watching the barn door rattle in its frame. The lantern light caught the dampness on her skin, the high arch of her cheekbone, the hollow of her throat. She looked wild and ancient, a part of the storm that had somehow been trapped indoors. She turned and caught him staring. This time, he did not look away. The air between them seemed to shift, charging with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. It was the sudden, shocking awareness of two bodies in a small space. Daniel felt a pull in his chest, a physical ache that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just desire, though that was there, buried deep under layers of guilt. It was a yearning for connection, for the warmth of another living thing. He took a step toward her, hardly realizing he was doing it. The scent of her hit him. Rain, wood smoke, and the musk of her skin. It was an earthy, honest smell. Naylin did not retreat. She stood her ground, her eyes wide, reflecting the lantern flame. Her lips parted slightly, a question hovering there. Daniel reached out. His hand hovered near her shoulder. He wanted to touch her, to see if she was real, to anchor himself against the loneliness that threatened to sweep him away like a flood. Her breath hitched. The sound was small, sharp. It broke the spell. Daniel froze. The image of Sarah's face, pale and smiling on their wedding day, flashed in his mind. Shame, hot and acidic, flooded his veins. What was he doing? This was a stranger. This was a woman of a different race. A woman his neighbors would shoot on sight. A woman who had likely seen things that would turn his blood to ice. And he was a grieving husband. He pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He stumbled a step backward, his boots scraping loud on the floorboards. I have to check the roof," he stammered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He turned and fled the barn, plunging out into the driving rain. The water soaked him instantly, cold and shocking, plastering his shirt to his skin. He stood in the mud, gasping for air, the rain mingling with the tears he refused to let fall. Inside the barn, Naylin stood alone in the circle of lantern light. She touched her shoulder where his hand had almost rested. Her expression did not change, but in the deep, dark wells of her eyes, a flicker of something new ignited. Not hope, exactly, but a recognition. He was broken, just like her, and for the first time since she had walked away from the grave of her son. She did not feel entirely alone. The rain continued to fall, washing the high desert clean, preparing the earth for whatever seeds might dare to grow in the morning. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It was not the polite, gray drizzle of the eastern states Daniel dimly remembered from his boyhood, but a violent, hammering deluge that turned the dry washes into raging brown rivers and the hard-pan earth into sucking clay. The world outside the homestead dissolved into a curtain of gray water, isolating the farm from the rest of the territory as effectively as an ocean. Daniel and Naylin were trapped. The barn became their universe. The house was too intimate, too filled with the ghosts of Daniel's past, and Naylin refused to sleep there regardless. So, the barn it was. Daniel spent his days there under the pretext of repairing the tack and tending the horses. But in truth, there was simply nowhere else to go. The roof of the main house had developed a leak over the kitchen, a rhythmic dripping that drove him mad. But the barn was tight and warm, smelling of sweet hay and the comforting musk of the animals. Naylin did not sit idle while the sky fell. She found a pile of Daniel's old shirts, discarded in a corner of the tech room, riddled with holes and tears. Without asking, she took a bone needle and a spool of thread from her small bundle of possessions and began to mend them. Daniel watched her from his spot on an overturned crate, where he was oiling a bridle. Her hands moved with a dexterity that fascinated him. She did not sew like a white woman, with delicate, pinching motions. She drove the needle through the fabric with strength, pulling the thread taut with a snap that sounded like a cricket chirping. "You do not have to do that," Daniel said, his voice sounding loud in the enclosed space. She did not look up. "The wind works against us outside. We work against the rot inside." A shirt with holes is a cold shirt. It was practical. Everything about her was practical. Daniel returned to his bridle, the rhythmic swish of the cloth and the tap of the rain creating a hypnotic cadence. As the hours stretched into days, the silence that had defined their early acquaintance began to thin. It did not break all at once, but eroded, like a canyon wall carved by a slow river. It started with the animals. Naylin had a way with the horses that Daniel envied. Buster, the gelding who had a habit of nipping at Daniel's shoulder whenever he was cinched, stood statue still for her. She spoke to the beasts in her own tongue, low, guttural sounds that seemed to vibrate in their chests. "What are you telling him?" Daniel asked on the second afternoon, watching as she picked a stone from Buster's hoof. Naylin lowered the hoof gently. "I tell him he is strong. I tell him the mud will dry. Horses worry, just like men. They fear the ground will swallow them." Daniel snorted softly. "I reckon men have more reason to worry than horses. A horse doesn't know about mortgage payments or drought. A horse knows hunger," Naylin countered, wiping her hands on her skirt. "And a horse knows when the hand that feeds it is shaking." Daniel paused, the rag in his hand stilling on the leather. He looked at his own hands. They were steady enough now, but he knew what she meant. He had spent the last 2 years trembling on the inside, a vibration of grief that never quite settled. The isolation of the storm stripped away the social guards Daniel usually held up. There was no one to judge him here, no preacher to frown at his unshaven face, no shopkeep to pity his empty wagon. There was only the rain, the horses, and this woman who had walked out of the desert with death in her eyes. On the third evening, the temperature dropped. Daniel built a small fire in the iron stove he kept in the corner of the workshop section of the barn. The heat radiated outward, combating the damp chill. Naylin sat on the floor near the stove, her legs tucked beneath her, watching the flames dance behind the grate. Daniel sat on his stool, whittling a piece of cedar just to keep his hands busy. "You asked about my wife," he said. The words came out before he had decided to speak them. Naylin turned her head slowly. The firelight caught the sharp angle of her nose and the deep, dark pools of her eyes. "I did. She died in this weather," Daniel said, staring at the shavings curling onto the floor. 2 years ago, it was a winter storm, much like this one. The doctor was in Benson. The creek was flooded. I could not get across, and he could not get here." He paused. The memory was a physical weight, heavy as a stone in his gut. "She was birthing our first, a boy. We were going to name him Samuel." Naylin remained silent, but her stillness was not empty. It was a vessel waiting to be filled. "She labored for 2 days. Daniel continued, his voice rough. "Toward the end, the fever took her. She did not know me. She was calling out for her mother, who was back in Ohio. I held her hand, but she was already gone. The baby." He never took a breath. The cedar stick snapped in his hands. Daniel looked down at the broken wood, surprising himself. He had not realized he was squeezing it so hard. "I buried them together," he whispered. "Under the cottonwood tree." "And the town?" Naylin asked. Her voice was gentle, lacking the morbid curiosity he often heard from the townsfolk. "Why do you not go to their spirit house?" "The church," Daniel threw the broken wood into the fire. It hissed and popped. After Sarah died, the preacher came out. He told me it was God's will. He said the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. He told me I should be grateful Sarah was in a better place. Daniel looked at Nayland, his eyes hard and bright with old anger. I told him to get off my land. I told him if God wanted Sarah, he could have come down and explained it to me himself, not sent a fever to burn her alive. I stopped going to Sunday service. I stopped going to socials. The town, they don't like a man who rejects their comfort. They say I've turned bitter. They say I've lost my way. Maybe you have, Nayland said softly. Daniel looked at her sharply, defensive. But, she continued, holding his gaze, maybe the way they walk is not the only path. When my son died, the medicine man sang for 3 days. It did not bring him back. It did not stop the hole in my chest from bleeding. Prayers are for the living. Daniel, the dead do not need them. It was the first time she had used his name. It sounded strange on her tongue, accented and deliberate. That night, the silence in the barn was different. It was not the silence of two strangers sharing a space, but the silence of two soldiers who had fought on different sides of the same terrible war, comparing their scars in the dark. The rain ceased on the 4th morning. The sun broke through the clouds with a brilliance that hurt the eyes, turning the flooded valley into a shimmering mirror. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of wet sage and damp earth. "We need supplies," Daniel announced, standing in the doorway of the barn and squinting at the mud. "The flour is low, and we need salt for the meat." Nayland emerged behind him, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. "I will come." Daniel hesitated. He looked at her, the dark skin, the Apache features, the buckskin dress. Then he looked toward the direction of the town, a cluster of wood and adobe buildings 5 miles down the valley. "It might be better if you stay," he said, trying to be gentle. "The town they are narrow-minded people. Nalin, they have long memories of the raids." "I have long memories too," Nayland said flatly. "But I am not afraid of white faces. I can carry the sacks. You have a limp when the damp sets in." Daniel blinked. He hadn't realized she had noticed the stiffness in his left knee, a souvenir from a horse kick years ago. He sighed, realizing arguing with her was like arguing with the wind. "Get in the wagon," he said. The ride to town was slow. The wheels of the buckboard churned through the thick mud, the horses straining in their collars. Daniel kept his rifle across his knees, a habit he couldn't break. Nayland sat beside him, her back straight, her eyes scanning the horizon. The town of Prosperity was a misnomer. It was a struggling collection of false-fronted buildings and muddy streets, clinging to the edge of the frontier like a barnacle on a ship's hull. As they rolled onto the main street, the activity of the mid-morning bustled around them. Men were clearing mud from the boardwalks. Women were crossing the street with baskets on their arms. The silence traveled with the wagon. As Daniel pulled the team to a halt in front of the general store, he felt the weight of the stairs. They were heavy, prickly things. Conversation stopped. A man hammering a loose board paused, his hammer held in midair. "Stay close," Daniel murmured. Nayland climbed down, ignoring the hand he offered. She stood on the boardwalk, brushing the travel dust from her skirt. They entered the store. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, a stark contrast to the atmosphere inside. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was behind the counter weighing nails for a rancher named Cobb. Both men turned. Henderson's smile died instantly. Cobb, a thick-necked man with a face reddened by whiskey and sun, narrowed his eyes. "Morning," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I need a sack of flour, 10 pounds of salt, and coffee." Henderson cleared his throat, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked at Daniel, then at Nayland, then back to Daniel. "We're a bit short on flour. Hayes, delivery hasn't come because of the rain. I see 50 sacks stacked behind you," Daniel said, nodding to the rear of the store. "Reserved." Henderson lied. His eyes darted nervously to Cobb. Daniel felt the heat rising in his neck. He stepped forward, his boot thudding on the floorboards. "Since when is my money not good here?" "Henderson, since you started harboring savages." Cobb spat. He turned fully, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. The word hung in the air, ugly and violent. Nayland did not flinch. She looked at Cobb with a detached curiosity, as if he were a beetle she had found under a rock. "She works for me," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "She is a hand, nothing more." Cobb laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "A hand? Is that what you call it? We heard you've got a squaw living in your barn. Hayes. Or maybe she's in the house now, replacing Sarah?" Daniel's hand twitched toward his hip. "Don't you speak her name." Nayland stepped forward. Her movement was so smooth it startled them. She placed the coins Daniel had given her on the counter. "Flour," she said clearly. "Salt. Coffee." Cobb looked at her, his face twisting in disgust. He leaned in, his sour breath washing over her. "We don't serve your kind here." He gathered a mouthful of saliva and spat. It hit the hem of her dress, a wet, degrading mark on the buckskin. The room seemed to freeze. Daniel felt a roar in his ears, a white-hot surge of rage and shame. He should draw. He should smash Cobb's face in. He should do something, but he froze. The fear was instantaneous and paralyzing, not for himself, but for the escalation. If he drew, they would kill him, and then they would kill her. The law would call it self-defense. He was outnumbered, and he was a pariah. Nayland looked down at the spittle on her dress. Then she looked up at Cobb. She did not wipe it away. She did not scream. She simply held his gaze until Cobb, unsettled by the void in her black eyes, took a half-step back. She turned to Daniel. "We go." Daniel stood rooted for a second longer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Henderson, who was staring at the counter, ashamed. He looked at Cobb, who was smirking. "Keep your flour," Daniel rasped. He turned and followed Nayland out. The walk back to the wagon was a gauntlet. Children stopped playing to stare. A woman on the boardwalk pulled her skirts back as Nayland passed, as if she carried a plague. They climbed onto the wagon seat in silence. Daniel whipped the horses into a trot, desperate to put the town behind them. He burned with shame. He had brought her there. He had exposed her to that. And when the moment came, he had done nothing but retreat. They did not speak for the entire ride home. That night, the tension in the house was unbearable. Daniel could not sit still. He paced the small kitchen, his boots echoing on the wood. He had cut his hand earlier, a foolish slip with a chisel while trying to fix the wagon wheel in a fit of distracted anger. The gash across his palm was deep, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He was trying to bandage it one-handed, fumbling with the strip of cloth, cursing softly. "Let me," a voice said. Nayland was standing in the doorway. He hadn't heard her come in. Daniel pulled his hand away. "It's fine. I can manage." She crossed the room. She did not ask for permission. She took his wrist in her hand. Her grip was strong, cool, and undeniable. "Sit," she commanded. Daniel sat at the kitchen table. Nayland brought a basin of water and a clean cloth. She washed the blood from his palm, her touch incredibly gentle for hands that were so calloused. She applied a poultice she had made from crushed sage and something else he didn't recognize, something that stung for a moment and then numbed the pain. Daniel watched the top of her head as she worked. He saw the few strands of gray in the black hair. He saw the steady rhythm of her breathing. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were heavy, pulled from the bottom of his chest. "About today, about Cobb, I should have done more." Nayland did not pause in her wrapping of the bandage. "I did not protect you," Daniel added bitterly. Nayland tied the knot at his wrist and looked up. "You think you are the first man to hate me?" she asked. "You think that was the first time a white man has spat at me?" She stood up, releasing his hand. "You did not join them. Daniel, that is enough." "It doesn't feel like enough," Daniel said, looking at his bandaged hand. "It feels like cowardice." Nayland reached out. For a moment, he thought she was going to slap him. Instead, she pressed the palm of her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the heat of her skin through his shirt. "You opened your door when I was starving," she whispered. "You gave me a blanket when the wind was cold. You defended my name when the fat man spoke it with poison. She leaned in slightly, her eyes searching for him. You don't owe me kindness. Daniel Hayes, no one owes Apache kindness in this world, but you gave it. Do not let their hate poison your heart. She pulled her hand away, but the warmth remained, branding his skin. The air in the kitchen grew thin. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, not as a refugee or a laborer, but as a woman. He saw the strength in her jaw, the curve of her neck, the life that refused to be extinguished despite everything the world had done to crush it. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to draw her into him, to hide in her strength, to let her hide in his. The desire was sudden and overwhelming. A physical ache that had nothing to do with the gash on his hand, but the ghosts were still there. Sarah's empty chair sat in the corner. The memory of the dead baby lay between them like a sword. "Good night, Nayland," he said, his voice straining. "Good night," she replied. She turned and walked out into the dark, leaving him alone with the silence. The next few days were a blur of labor. The sun baked the mud into hard, cracked earth. The wheat that had survived the flood needed tending. The fences needed repairing. They worked side by side, speaking little, but moving with a synchronized rhythm. When he lifted a rail, she was there to hammer the nail. When she carried the water, he was there to open the gate. They were a team, a survival unit. But the tension was growing. It was in the way their eyes met and held a second too long when they passed the water ladle. It was in the way Daniel found himself watching her walk back to the barn in the twilight. It was in the way Nayland lingered in the kitchen after the dishes were done. They were two lonely people on an island of dust, and the gravity between them was becoming inescapable. It broke on a Tuesday morning. Daniel was in the lower field, hoeing the weeds that had sprung up with the rain. The sun was already high, beating down on his shoulders. Sweat soaked his shirt, stinging his eyes. He was tired, his muscles aching, his mind drifting in the haze of repetitive motion. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the earth. He stopped and leaned on the hoe, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Nayland was walking toward him. She was barefoot, her feet kicking up small puffs of dust. The sunlight caught the sheen of sweat on her neck. She had tied her hair back with a strip of leather, exposing the elegant line of her throat. She stopped 3 feet from him. She did not have water. She did not have a tool. Daniel looked at her. There was a strange intensity in her face, a resolve that looked almost like fear, but harder. "What is it?" he asked. "Is something wrong with the horses?" Nayland shook her head. She took a step closer. She smelled of sunshine and sage. She looked up at him, her black eyes locking onto his blue ones. She did not blink. She did not tremble. "I want a child from you," she whispered. The world seemed to stop. The cicadas in the brush went silent. The wind died. Daniel's hands went numb. The hoe slipped from his grip and hit the ground with a dull thud, narrowly missing his boot. He stared at her, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. His brain refused to process the words. It was too bold, too impossible, too dangerous. "What?" he finally managed to choke out. He sounded like a man who had been punched in the throat. Nayland did not look away. She did not retreat into shame. "I want a child," she repeated, her voice gaining a fierce, desperate edge. Daniel took a step back, stumbling slightly on a cloud of earth. "Nayland, you—" "We can't." "Why?" she asked. He stammered, his hands flapping uselessly at his sides. Because it's not right. I am white. You are." She stepped into his space, closing the distance he had tried to create. "I lost one," she said, her voice cracking with a sudden, raw pain that cut through him. "I lost my son. The silence is too loud. Daniel, I want to live again. I want to leave something behind that is not just bones in the dirt." She reached out and touched his arm. Her fingers were hot. "You are kind," she said. "You are a good man. You have strong hands. You have a gentle heart. There are no other men like you left in my world." Daniel looked down at her. He saw the tears standing in her eyes, unshed. He saw the terrifying vulnerability of her request. She was offering him everything, her body, her future, her hope, and asking for the one thing he had been terrified to even think about since Sarah died. Life. He pulled his arm away, panic rising in his chest. It was too much. It was a sin. It was a danger. If the town knew, if God knew. "I can't," he said, his voice shaking. "Nalin, I can't. It's wrong." He turned and walked away. He walked fast, almost running, heading for the creek bed, anywhere to get away from the burning intensity of her gaze. He left her standing in the field, a solitary figure amidst the green shoots of wheat, but he could not outrun the image of her face. That night, Daniel lay in his bed, the sheets tangled around his legs. The house was silent, but he could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. He stared at the empty side of the bed. He thought of the preacher's words about sin. He thought of Cobb's spitting face. Then he thought of Nalen's hand on his chest. He thought of her sewing his shirts. He thought of the way she had looked at him in the field, not with lust, but with a profound, sacred hunger for life. "I want to live again." He rolled over, burying his face in the pillow. His body ached with a need that had been starved for 2 years. His heart ached with a loneliness that was suddenly unbearable. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was not going to sleep. And he knew that the wall he had built around himself had finally, irrevocably crumbled. The days that followed Nalen's request were filled with a silence so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing against Daniel's chest. The easy rhythm they had established during the rains was gone, replaced by a jagged, nervous tension that made the very air in the house vibrate. Daniel avoided the barn. He woke before dawn, drank his coffee standing up in the dark kitchen, and was out in the fields before the sun had painted the Dragoon Mountains with its first touch of violet light. He worked with a manic intensity, driving his body until his muscles screamed, trying to exhaust the thoughts that swirled in his mind like dust devils. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. He saw the raw, terrifying honesty in her black eyes. "I want a child from you." Nalin, for her part, became a ghost again. She did her chores with silent efficiency, but she kept her distance. When he entered the room, she left it. When he sat on the porch to mend a tool, she vanished into the loft. She did not look at him, and that absence of contact hurt him more than her gaze ever had. The isolation began to rot him from the inside. He needed to speak, to hear a voice that was not the wind or his own tortured conscience. On the 4th day, he saddled the mare, blew, and rode into town. It was a Thursday, and prosperity was quiet. Daniel tied his horse in front of the small, whitewashed church that sat at the end of the main street. It was a humble structure, the paint peeling in the harsh sun, the bell tower listing slightly to the left. He had not stepped foot inside since Sarah's funeral. Reverend Thomas was inside, polishing the brass candlesticks on the altar. He was an old man, dried out by the desert like a piece of beef jerky, with eyes that were quick to judge and slow to forgive. He looked up as the heavy oak door creaked open, his eyebrows knitting together in surprise. "Daniel Hayes," the Reverend said, his voice dry as parchment. "It has been a long time." Daniel took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. "I need a word. Reverend, if you have the time." The preacher set down his polishing rag and descended the altar steps. "For a lost sheep. I always have time. What troubles you, son?" Daniel hesitated. He could not tell the truth. To speak the truth would be to sign Nalen's death warrant in this town. He had to speak in riddles, in the safe, abstract language of scripture and morality. "It is about loneliness," Daniel started, looking at the floorboards. "And duty? Go on. If a man is alone," Daniel said, choosing his words with agonizing care, "and he finds comfort in a place that society, that the church, might frown upon, is it a sin to seek that comfort? If the intent is not malice, but just life?" Reverend Thomas stiffened. He was not a stupid man. He knew the rumors. He knew about the woman at Hayes' place. Comfort is a dangerous word. "Daniel," the preacher said, his voice dropping an octave, "it is often a mask for lust, and lust is a fire that consumes a man's standing, his soul, and his community. But what if it is not just lust? Daniel asked, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. What if there is a need to build something, to not let the line die out? The Reverend stepped closer, his eyes cold and hard. The Bible tells us to be unequally yoked with unbelievers is a path to ruin. You are a white man. Daniel, you have a heritage. You have a bloodline that connects you to the civilizations of the East, to the history of this nation. To mix that blood with the heathen, with those who do not know God, is to invite chaos. Daniel felt a cold stone settle in his gut. Lust and loneliness can make a man lose his standing, the preacher warned, lifting a bony finger. And once that standing is lost, it is not easily regained. Do not mistake the temptations of the flesh for the will of God. Cast it out, Daniel, before it takes root. Daniel looked at the old man, seeing the rigid, ironclad worldview that allowed no room for gray, no room for mercy, and certainly no room for an Apache woman who had lost her son. Thank you, Reverend, Daniel said quietly. He put his hat back on and walked out. The sunlight outside felt blinding, but the church had felt like a tomb. When he returned to the farm, it was late afternoon. The shadows were stretching long across the yard. The silence of the homestead was different today. It felt hollow. He walked to the barn to tend to the horse. The tack room door was open. Inside, he saw Nayland's small bundle of possessions sitting on the crate. Her blanket was rolled tight. Her few spare clothes were folded. She was leaving. Panic, sharp and sudden, seized him. He turned and ran out of the barn, scanning the property. She was not at the well. She was not in the garden. He found her on the hill behind the house, beneath the sprawling cottonwood tree where 2 wooden crosses marked the earth. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands resting on her lap. She was not praying, not in the way the Reverend would understand, but she was communicating. She was speaking to the dead. Daniel approached slowly, the dry grass crunching beneath his boots. Nayland did not turn, but he knew she heard him. She remained still, a statue carved from mahogany and grief. You are packing, Daniel said. It was not a question. Nayland nodded slowly. She reached out and brushed a fallen leaf from the mound of earth that covered Sarah. You went to the spirit man in the town, she said. Her voice was calm, resigned. You sought permission, and he told you that I am dirt. Daniel flinched. He did not know how she knew. Or perhaps she just knew the world better than he did. He told me what men like him always say. Daniel replied. Nayland stood up. She turned to face him. Her face was composed, but her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. I was foolish, she said. I thought, because you fed me, because you looked at me, that we were the same. But the wall is too high. Daniel, I will not stay to watch you look at me with shame. I will not stay to be your secret sin. She gestured to the graves. I would never erase her, she whispered, looking down at Sarah's cross. I know what it is to love a ghost. I respect her, but I will not die forgotten either. The words hit Daniel with the force of a physical blow. I will not die forgotten. It was the same fear that woke him in the middle of the night, the fear that he would wither away on this farm. The last haze, leaving nothing behind but a rotting house and a fence line swallowed by the sagebrush. He looked at her, this woman who had survived massacres, starvation, and the cruelty of a nation, standing there with her chin high, demanding her right to exist, to be remembered. The dam inside him broke, the Reverend's voice, the town's whispers, the fear of Cobb, it all shattered under the weight of the undeniable, living truth standing in front of him. He stepped forward. He did not think. He acted on instinct, on a biological imperative that was older than churches or laws. He reached out and took her face in his rough hands. Nayland froze, her eyes widening. Daniel kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the courtly, polite affection he had shown Sarah during their courtship. It was desperate. It was a collision of 2 starving souls. It tasted of salt and dust and a terrifying need. For a heartbeat, she was rigid. Then she made a sound, a low, broken sob, and melted into him. Her arms came up, wrapping around his neck with a strength that surprised him. She pulled him closer, pressing her body against his as if she were trying to merge with him, to escape the solitude of her own skin. They sank to their knees in the grass beside the graves of his past, but they were consumed by the present. The first time was not graceful. It was raw and frantic. They fumbled with buttons and ties, their hands shaking. There was no seduction, only a mutual, overwhelming necessity. When skin touched skin, Daniel felt a shock go through him that nearly stopped his heart. She was so warm. She was so alive. He wept. He couldn't help it. As he held her, buried his face in the crook of her neck, the tears he had been holding back for 2 years finally came. He cried for Sarah. He cried for the baby he never held. And he cried for the sheer, impossible relief of not being alone. Nayland did not pull away. She held him. She pressed her forehead against his, her own breath hitching in ragged gasps. She anchored him. She took his grief and gave him her own in return. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of red and orange, they were lying tangled together in the grass, covered by his coat. The air was cooling rapidly, but Daniel felt a fire in his blood that the desert night could not touch. He looked at her. Her hair was loose, spread out like a dark fan on the earth. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, ancient. "You stay," he rasped, his voice wrecked. Nayland reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I stay." The next morning, the kitchen smelled of coffee, strong, black coffee. Daniel sat at the table, watching the steam rise from his cup. Nayland was at the stove, turning corn cakes on the griddle. They did not speak. There was no need for words. The silence that filled the room now was not heavy or tense. It was comfortable, like a well-worn pair of boots. He watched the sway of her hips as she moved. He watched the way the morning light caught the back of her neck. Everything had changed. The color of the light seemed different. The sound of the wind was different. She brought a plate to the table and set it down. She sat opposite him. "Eat," she said. Daniel took a bite. It was good. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, her eyes lowering to her cup, but he saw the ghost of a smile touch the corner of her mouth. It was a small victory, but it felt like a triumph. The weeks that followed were a revelation. It was a time of discovery, of learning the map of another human being. The passion between them deepened, settling from that first desperate explosion into something steady and consuming. They found laughter in stolen moments. When a calf kicked over the milk bucket and soaked Daniel's trousers, or when Nayland tried to use a fork and decided it was a foolish instrument, tossing it aside with a snort of disdain. They worked the land together, but now there was a partnership that went beyond labor. One afternoon, in the heat of the day, Daniel showed her the irrigation ditches. "You have to angle the spade like this," he explained, demonstrating the motion. "If you go straight down, the clay sticks. If you slice it, it falls away." Nayland took the spade. She mimicked his movement perfectly. "The water is life," she said, watching the muddy stream trickle down the row of corn, "but you force it. You make it go in straight lines." "Water likes to wander," Daniel admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But crops like straight lines. The earth does not like straight lines," she countered. "That is why the white man fights the land. You try to make squares out of circles." Daniel laughed, a sound that felt rusty in his throat but good. "And how would you grow corn? Nayland, in a circle?" She pointed to a patch of wild amaranth growing near the fence. "The plants know where to go. You listen to them." She taught him. She took him walking in the twilight, pointing out the scrubby bushes he had spent years ignoring or hacking away. "This is cash," she said, touching a creosote bush. "Good for the stomach when it burns. And this," she pointed to a small, unassuming plant with gray leaves. "This is chilawi. We make tea from it. It quiets the mind." She taught him the Apache names for the mountains, the wind, and the stars. She told him stories of the coyote, the trickster, and the mountain spirits who danced in the lightning. In return, he read to her in the evenings. He had a small collection of books, the Bible, a battered copy of Shakespeare, and an almanac. She liked the sound of the words, even if the meanings were sometimes strange to her. She found Romeo and Juliet ridiculous. Why did they not just run to the mountains? She asked, but she listened with rapt attention, her head resting on his knee as he sat in the rocking chair. They were building a world, a small, fragile world encompassed by the fence line of the Hayes homestead. But the world outside the fence was not idle. The first warning came 3 weeks after that night at the grave. Daniel had to go into town for supplies again. This time, he insisted Nayland stay behind. The memory of the spittle on her dress was still too fresh, and he could not bear the thought of exposing her to it again. He rode blue, leaving the wagon behind. He wanted to be fast, as he was loading a sack of grain onto the back of his saddle outside the general store. A shadow fell over him. He turned. It was Cobb. Accompanied by 2 other men Daniel recognized from the Cattle Association, Miller and Stone. They were leaning against the hitching rail, smoking cigarettes that smelled of harsh tobacco. "Hayes," Cobb said, his voice thick with false conviviality. "We haven't seen you at the association meetings." "Been busy," Daniel said, tightening the cinch strap. "So we hear," Miller said. He was a thin man with a wandering eye. "We hear you've been very busy. Plowing new fields. Are we?" The men laughed. It was a low, ugly sound. Daniel straightened up, his hand resting near his hip. "I tend my own land. Miller, I suggest you tend yours." "Oh, we are," Cobb said, pushing off the rail and stepping closer. "That's the point. Hayes, we are tending our land and our community." He spat on the ground, perilously close to Daniel's boot. "You see, there's a natural order to things." Cobb continued, his face hardening. "God made the white man, and he made the red man, and he put a desert between them for a reason. When a man lays down with a savage, he ain't just dirtying his own sheets. He's damaging the white race. He's inviting chaos into the valley." Daniel stared at him, his blood running cold. This wasn't just schoolyard bullying anymore. This was a threat. "She is a human being," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. "Which is more than I can say for you right now." Cobb's face turned a violent shade of purple. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to his gun. "You watch your mouth, nigger lover," Cobb hissed. "Don't do it." "Cobb," a new voice cut through the tension. The men turned. Standing on the boardwalk was a man Daniel had never seen before. He was tall, wearing a duster coat that had seen better years, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He had a repeating Winchester rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. His face was a map of scars, and his eyes were the color of wet flint. "I'm looking for a man named Hayes," the stranger said, "but I don't like to see a man shot over words. It makes the paperwork tedious." Cobb looked at the rifle, then at the stranger's cold eyes. He spat again, backed away, and signaled his friends, "You're marked. Hayes." Cobb growled as he retreated. "Remember that." The ranchers moved off toward the saloon. Daniel did not relax. He looked at the stranger. "I'm Hayes," Daniel said. The stranger nodded. He stepped off the boardwalk, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a mountain lion. "Name's Silas Vance," the man said. "Used to scout for the 3rd Cavalry. Now I work for the Territory." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it up. It was a sketch, crude, but recognizable. It was Nayland. "There's talk of an Apache woman who slipped the reservation at San Carlos a while back," Vance said, watching Daniel's face closely. "Major there is mighty upset. Says she's an agitator. Says she might have stolen government property." Daniel kept his face a mask of stone. He looked at the drawing, then back at Vance. "I've had drifters come through," Daniel lied. "They work for a meal and move on. I don't ask names." Vance smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I bet. The thing is, Hayes, the Apache don't just drift. They home, and I've got a nose for it. I've been tracking this one for 300 miles, Lost the trail in the rain, but the wind whispers things. Vance folded the paper and put it away. I'll be around for a few days, Vance said. If you see her, or if you remember anything, you let me know. There's a $20 reward. He paused, then leaned in closer. And Hayes, if you are harboring a fugitive, well, the Army calls that treason. Around here, we just call it a suicide note. Vance tipped his hat and walked away, the spurs on his boots jingling softly. Daniel rode home at a gallop. He pushed Blue harder than he ever had, his heart hammering in his throat. The dust of the road choked him. The world was closing in. When he arrived at the farm, the sun was setting. Naylin was in the garden, weeding the beans. She stood up as he thundered into the yard, sensing his fear before he even dismounted. He told her. He told her about Cobb. He told her about Vance. He told her about the drawing. Naylin stood very still. She looked at the horizon, sniffing the air as if she could smell the bounty hunter's scent on the wind. He is a tracker, she said softly. If he was a scout, he knows the signs. He will find the tracks of my feet. He will find the way the grass is bent. She turned to Daniel, her eyes fierce. The earth never forgets blood. Daniel, we must be ready to run. Run, Daniel asked, breathless. Where? Mexico, she said. The Sierra Madre. My people hide there. The white soldiers do not go there. Daniel looked at the house he had built with his own hands. He looked at the fields he had watered with his sweat. He looked at the grave of his wife. To leave was to admit defeat. To leave was to become a criminal. To leave was to lose everything he had ever known. No, he said. Naylin grabbed his arm. You do not understand. They will come. They will kill you to get to me. Let them try, Daniel said, a stubborn, dangerous anger taking root in his chest. He gripped her shoulders. You are not a fugitive. Naylin, not to me. You are my wife in everything but the paper. You are the mother of the child we are going to have. He pulled her close, holding her tight against the trembling of his own body. You are my home now, he whispered into her hair, and I will not let them burn my home down again. Naylin rested her head against his chest, listening to the frantic beating of his heart. She did not argue, but as she looked out over his shoulder at the darkening desert, she knew the truth. Love was powerful, but a Winchester rifle was louder, and the storm that was coming would not be satisfied with just rain. The moon was a sliver of bone against the black throat of the sky when the dogs began to bark. Daniel sat up in bed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had been sleeping lightly for weeks, a pistol beneath his pillow and his boots standing ready by the bed frame. Beside him, Naylin was already awake. Her hand was on his arm, her grip tight, her eyes wide and reflecting the faint starlight filtering through the window. Listen, she whispered. Outside. The barking cut off abruptly with a wet yelp that made Daniel's stomach turn. Then came the silence, heavy, unnatural, and terrifying. Daniel threw the quilt back, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He reached for his boots, but before his hand could touch the leather, the window shattered. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the floorboards like diamond dust. A heavy object thudded against the far wall, rolling to a stop near the hearth. It was a bottle, the rag stuffed in its neck burning with a hungry orange flame. Fire! Daniel roared. The bottle shattered, and the kerosene ignited with a whoosh that sounded like a giant intake of breath. The flames leaped up the dry timber walls, consuming the curtains Sarah had sewn 5 years ago. The room filled instantly with thick, acrid smoke. Out! Daniel shouted, grabbing Naylin's hand. We have to go. They did not have time for boots. They did not have time for the supplies he had staged near the door. He grabbed his gun belt and the Winchester leaning against the headboard, and they scrambled toward the back door leading to the kitchen. Another bottle smashed through the front window. The heat was already searing, pushing them back. They burst out the back door into the cool night air, stumbling onto the hard-packed dirt of the yard. There he is, a voice shouted from the darkness near the corral. A gunshot cracked, the sound flat and loud. A bullet kicked up dust inches from Daniel's bare foot. Run! Daniel yelled, shoving Nayland toward the irrigation ditch. More shots rang out, flashing like fireflies from the tree line. They were being herded, pushed away from the house and the barn. Daniel turned and fired blindly into the dark, pumping the lever of his rifle, hoping to buy them a second of hesitation. He heard a man curse, but he did not wait to see if he had hit his mark. They scrambled into the dry ditch, the steep sides scraping their skin. The mud at the bottom was cool and slick. They ran low, hunched over, moving toward the dense mesquite brush that marked the edge of his property. Behind them, a great roar went up. Daniel glanced back once. The barn was burning. The dry hay in the loft had caught, sending a pillar of fire 50 feet into the air. The horses were screaming, a high, terrified sound that tore at Daniel's soul. He stopped, his chest heaving. The horses! He gasped. No! Nayland grabbed his shirt, pulling him forward with surprising strength. You cannot save them. You can only save us. He looked at the fire, watching the structure he had built with his father crumble into an inferno. His life, his legacy, his work, his memories was turning to ash and rising into the indifferent stars. Another shot whined over their heads, slapping into the mud bank. Move, Nayland commanded. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. They left the farm behind, crossing the fence line and plunging into the raw, unforgiving desert. The ground was a torture of sharp stones, goathead thorns, and cactus spines. Every step was a lesson in pain, but adrenaline masked the worst of it. They did not stop until the glow of the fire was a faint orange smudge on the horizon, miles behind them. They slid down the crumbling bank of a dry arroyo, collapsing onto the sand under the shelter of an overhanging ledge. Daniel lay on his back, gasping for air, his chest heaving violently. His feet were bleeding, cut in a dozen places. Nayland sat beside him, her breathing controlled, her eyes scanning the rim of the wash above them. It is done, she said softly. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. They burned everything. The house, the barn, everything I had. He sat up, wincing as he shifted his weight. He looked at Nayland. She was covered in soot, her dress torn at the shoulder, her feet bloody. She looked small in the vastness of the night, yet unbreakable. I am sorry, he rasped, the guilt choking him. I should have listened. I should have sold the land. I should have taken you away weeks ago. He looked down at his hands, blackened by the smoke. I have nothing left to give you. Nayland, I am a man with no name and no home. Nayland reached out. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her touch was cool against his feverish skin. You are wrong, she said. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. Before I came to your barn, I was dead. My heart was a stone. My womb was a grave. You did not just give me food. Daniel, you gave me back breath. She pulled back slightly, her eyes fierce in the gloom. Let them have the wood and the stone. They cannot burn what is in here. She placed a hand on her belly. And they cannot burn what is between us. Daniel looked at her, feeling the truth of her words anchor him in the chaos. He took her hand and kissed the palm, tasting salt and earth. Where do we go? He asked. South, she said, looking toward the silhouette of the distant mountains. Into the high places, where the horse soldiers cannot bring their wagons, where the white man sees only rocks, but the Apache sees a garden. The journey that followed was a descent into a world Daniel had lived beside for 10 years but never truly entered. The desert changed as they climbed higher into the Dragoon Mountains. The rolling sagebrush flats gave way to jagged granite spires and canyons that twisted like snakes. For Daniel, it was a brutal test of endurance. He was a farmer, a man used to soft soil and predictable rows. Here, the land fought him. The sun beat down with a hammer's weight. His bare feet, initially raw and blistered, slowly began to harden, turning into callous leather, but the process was agony. He learned to walk with his eyes on the ground, scanning for the rattlesnakes that dozed in the shade and the cholla cactus that seemed to jump at the flesh. For Nayland, it was a homecoming. She moved through the terrain with a fluidity that made her seem part of the landscape. She knew where the water hid. She would stop at a seemingly dry rock face, dig into the sand at its base, and find a seep of cool, clear water. She knew which roots could be roasted and eaten, and which berries would stop the gnawing hunger in their bellies. She made sandals for them out of woven yucca fibers and strips of leather cut from Daniel's gun belt. They were crude, but they saved their feet from the worst of the stones. They spoke little during the day, conserving their moisture, but at night, huddled together under rock overhangs or in thickets of manzanita, they whispered. "You are doing well," Nayland told him on the 5th night. She was rubbing a salve made of crushed creosote leaves onto his sunburned neck. "I feel like a child," Daniel admitted, "watching the fireflies dance. I stumble, I pant. I would be dead in a day without you. You are learning to listen," she said. "The white man walks loud. He wants the earth to know he is coming. The Apache walks quiet. He wants the earth to forget he is there." As they pushed deeper into the mountains, the landscape became more severe, more beautiful, and more haunted. On the 8th day, they crested a ridge and looked down into a wide, bowl-shaped valley. Nayland stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel came up beside her. "What is it?" She did not answer. She began to walk down the slope, her pace quickening. Daniel hurried to keep up. The valley floor was littered with the skeletons of trees, blackened. Charred stumps stuck out of the ground like broken teeth. As they got closer, Daniel realized they were not just trees. They were the remains of wickiups, the dome-shaped brush shelters of the Apache. It was a village, or it had been. The silence here was different. It was not the peaceful silence of the desert, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. The ground was strewn with broken pottery, rusted metal, and bleached bones that the coyotes had scattered. Nayland walked into the center of the ruins. She moved slowly, like a sleepwalker. She stopped at a circle of stones that had once been a fire ring. This was the place of the gathering. She whispered, "My mother sat here. My sister sat there." She turned in a slow circle, her eyes taking in the devastation. "The soldiers came at dawn," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrible. "They burned the winter stores. They shot the horses. Those who ran were cut down by the saber. Those who surrendered were marched to the lowlands." She walked to a spot where a small, charred post stood. She sank to her knees. Daniel watched her, his heart aching. He felt like an intruder. He was a white man standing in the graveyard created by white men. He wanted to look away, to leave her to her grief, but he could not abandon her. Nayland began to dig in the dirt with her hands. She scooped up a handful of the ash-gray soil. She brought it to her lips and whispered into it, "Itzachu, Goyathle, Nantan." She was naming them, calling the roll of the dead. She poured the dirt over her head, letting it dust her hair and shoulders. Then she scooped up another handful. Daniel stepped forward. He knelt beside her. The ash stained his knees. Nayland looked at him. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but she did not shed them. The Apache did not give their water to the dead. They kept it for the living. Daniel reached out and took a handful of the earth. It felt gritty and cold. "I did not know them," he said softly. "But I know you, and because you are one of them, they are part of me now." He poured the dirt over his own hands, washing them in the memory of her people. Nayland watched him, her chest hitching. She reached out and covered his dirty hands with hers. They knelt there for a long time, two refugees amidst the ruins, bound together by the dust of the lost. "We cannot stay here," Nayland said finally, standing up and brushing the ash from her skirt. "The ghosts are too loud. They will not let us sleep." They moved on, leaving the Valley of the Dead behind. 2 days later, they found the sanctuary. It was a hidden canyon, accessible only by a narrow fissure in the rock that a man on horseback would miss entirely. Inside, the walls widened to reveal a lush, verdant oasis. A spring gushed from the rock wall. feeding a pool of crystal-clear water that spilled over into a stream lined with cottonwoods and wild mint. The air was cool and smelled of damp moss. High up on the canyon wall, there was a shallow cave, protected by an overhang that kept out the rain and the wind. "This is it," Daniel said, staring up at the cave. "This is home." They set to work. It was a different kind of labor than farming. There were no straight lines here. They built a wall of stones across the mouth of the cave to block the wind. They gathered soft boughs of pine and juniper for a bed. They wove baskets from willow shoots to store the acorns and piñón nuts they gathered. Daniel made a bow. It took him 3 tries and Nalen's patient instruction to get the tension right. But eventually, he brought down a mule deer. They feasted on the meat, roasting it over a smokeless fire of dry juniper wood. They cured the hide to make warm blankets for the coming winter. Life slowed down. The frantic pace of the white world, the clocks, the schedules, the demands of the market ceased to exist. They rose with the sun and slept with the moon. Nalen's body began to change. Her belly, once flat and hard, began to swell with the promise of new life. Her face softened, the sharp angles of starvation giving way to a healthy glow. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Daniel pulled a piece of ironwood from his pocket. He had been working on it for weeks, whittling it with a small penknife he had managed to save. He held it out to her. It was a necklace. The pendant was carved in the shape of a quail. The bird Nalin said carried the spirit of protection. It was polished smooth with river sand until it shone like dark glass. "For me?" Nalen asked, taking it gently. "For you," Daniel said. "And for Aelin." Nalen slipped the leather thong over her head. The bird rested against her collarbone. She looked at Daniel, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "When I came to your barn," she said quietly, "I had a plan. I wanted to use you. I wanted a child, and I needed a man to give it to me. You were a tool, Daniel Hayes, a means to an end." Daniel smiled ruefully. "I figured as much, but now," she continued, reaching out to touch his hand, "the plan is broken. I wanted only a child, but now, I want you too. I want you to see her grow. I want you to teach her to carve wood. I want you to wake up beside me when we are old and the winter is cold." Daniel turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. The contrast was stark, his large, pale hand against her smaller, darker one, but the fit was perfect. "You are not mine to own." "Nalin," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I learned that the hard way. You belong to the wind in the mountains, but I will stand beside you. I will stand beside you until the stars forget to rise and the sun forgets to set." She squeezed his hand. "Hard. That is a long time." "It is just a start," he replied. The summer rains came late that year, but they came with a vengeance. The season of the monsoon turned the sky into a bruising purple bruise every afternoon. Thunder rolled through the canyons like artillery fire. Daniel and Nalen were in the canyon bottom, gathering wild grapes that grew along the stream bank. The air was heavy and still, charged with electricity. "We should go back up," Nalin said, glancing at the sky. "The clouds are dark over the headwaters." "It's just a shower," Daniel said, reaching for a high cluster of grapes. "We need to fill this basket." He didn't hear the roar until it was too late. It sounded like a freight train, a deep, grinding rumble that vibrated through the soles of his feet. Nalen's eyes went wide. "Run!" she screamed. "To water!" Daniel dropped the basket. He turned to run toward the trail leading up to the cave, but the sound was already on top of them. A wall of water, 10 feet high, brown and churning with logs and boulders, exploded around the bend of the canyon. It moved faster than a horse at a gallop. Daniel scrambled up the bank, pushing Nalin ahead of him. "Go! Go!" She reached the higher ledge, scrambling up the slick rock. She turned and reached down for him. Daniel lunged for her hand. His fingers brushed hers. Then the water hit him. It was like being struck by a mountain. The cold, suffocating weight slammed into him, tearing him from the bank. He tumbled over and over, darkness spinning with light. He felt his shoulders slam against a rock. He swallowed mud. The roar filled his head, drowning out his own thoughts. He fought. He kicked and clawed, trying to find the surface, but the current was a monster. It dragged him down, pinning him against the bottom. His lungs burned. The darkness began to creep in at the edges of his vision. He thought of Nalin. He thought of the baby. He thought, "Not yet. Please, God, not yet." Then, something grabbed his shirt. It was a yank, fierce and desperate. He broke the surface, gasping in a mouthful of air and spray. Nalin was waist-deep in the swirling eddy near the canyon wall, holding onto a tree root with one hand and gripping his collar with the other. Her face was a mask of terror and determination. She pulled. He kicked, finding a foothold on a submerged rock. Together, they fought the river, inch by inch. They dragged themselves out of the churning brown death and onto the solid rock of the ledge. Daniel collapsed, retching water, coughing until his ribs ached. He lay on the stone, shivering violently, the adrenaline crashing out of his system. Nalin was over him instantly. She was slapping his face, shaking his shoulders. "Breathe!" she screamed. "Breathe! Daniel!" He opened his eyes. She was hovering over him, soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face. She was sobbing, great, heaving, ugly sobs that tore from her throat. It was the sound of a woman who had looked into the abyss of loss and refused to jump. "I'm here," he wheezed, reaching up to touch her wet cheek. "I'm here. Nalin." She collapsed onto his chest, burying her face in his neck. She held him with a ferocity that hurt. Her fingernails dug into his skin. She rocked back and forth, crying the tears she hadn't cried for her son, the tears she hadn't cried for her village, the tears she hadn't cried for the burning farm. He held her, stroking her hair, whispering her name over and over against the roar of the flood. They stayed there until the water began to recede and the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the canyon in a golden, surreal light. That night, back in the safety of the cave, the fire cast long, dancing shadows on the rock walls. They were bruised and exhausted, but alive. Nalin undressed him slowly, checking his bruises, kissing the purple welt on his shoulder where the rock had hit him. She stripped off her own wet clothes and lay down beside him on the pine boughs. There was no desperation this time, no frantic need to prove they existed. There was only a deep, slow reverence. When they made love, it was a quiet thing. It was the movement of two survivors who had been tested by fire and by water and had come out the other side whole. Daniel memorized the curve of her spine, the beat of her heart against his ribs. Nalin held his face, looking into his eyes as if trying to map his soul. They moved together in the flickering light, rebuilding their world one touch, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. Outside, the floodwaters rushed onto the sea, but inside the cave, everything was still. The winter snows had retreated to the highest peaks of the dragoons, leaving the lower canyons awash in the vibrant green of scrub oak and the violent blooming of ocotillo. In the hidden cave, the air had lost its biting edge, replaced by the scent of warming earth and resinous pine. Nalin's belly had grown round and heavy. She moved with a slower grace now, her hand often resting on the swell of life beneath her buckskin dress. The child was active, kicking against her ribs in the quiet hours of the night, a constant reminder of the future they were trying to carve out of stone and shadow. But with the promise of life came the threat of fragility. Nalin had begun to tire easily. Her ankles swelled in the heat of the afternoon, and a shadowed pallor had settled beneath her eyes. She spoke of a specific route, OSHA, and clean linen for the birthing, things the canyon could not fully provide. More pressing was the need for laudanum or whiskey. She anticipated hard labor, having sensed the baby was positioned strangely. "We need supplies," Daniel said one evening, watching her wince as she shifted near the fire. Nalin shook her head, staring into the flames. "It is too dangerous. The bounty hunter will not have left. Men like him are like ticks. They bury their heads and wait." "He cannot wait forever," Daniel argued gently. He smoothed the piece of leather he was working on. "I will not go to Prosperity. I will ride east to Dos Cabezas. It is a mining camp, rough, transient. No one knows my face there. He saw the fear in her eyes, a sharp, jagged thing that she usually kept hidden. She knew the necessity, but she also knew the cost. "You will come back," she stated. It was a command, not a question. "I will come back." Daniel left 2 days later, riding blue before the sun had cracked the horizon. He had altered his appearance as best he could. He had let his beard grow wild and thick, covering the lower half of his face. He wore a battered slouch hat he had found near an abandoned prospector's camp, pulled low over his eyes. He looked less like a farmer now, and more like the drifting wreckage of the territory, one of the many nameless men wandering in search of silver or oblivion. Dos Cabezas was a festering sore of a town, clinging to the rocky slopes of the mountains. It was a place of canvas tents, hastily erected shacks, and the constant, rhythmic thud of stamp mills crushing ore. The air tasted of sulfur and unwashed bodies. Daniel tied Blue behind a livery stable, tossing the boy there a silver dollar to keep his mouth shut. He moved through the crowded streets with his head down, his shoulders hunched. He bought a bottle of whiskey from a tent saloon, the barkeep barely glancing at him. He traded a few deer hides for a bolt of clean cotton cloth at the mercantile. The medicine was harder. He had to visit the camp doctor, a man with shaking hands and eyes yellowed by jaundice. Daniel claimed the laudanum was for a toothache. The doctor overcharged him, demanding $3. But Daniel paid without a word. He had everything. He turned to leave, the supplies tucked into a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He was crossing the muddy thoroughfare, stepping around a sleeping drunk, when a voice cut through the din of the camp. "That is a fine horse you have tied back there, friend." Daniel froze. The voice was like gravel grinding on glass. He knew it. He turned slowly. Silas Vance was leaning against a support post of the boardwalk, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He looked unchanged by the months. The same dusted coat, the same dead flint eyes. He was watching Daniel with a terrifying, casual interest. Daniel kept his hand away from his gun. "Just a horse," he muttered, pitching his voice lower, rougher. Vance smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I know that horse. Saw him pull a plow near a burning barn a few months back. Big animal, strong, distinctive white sock on the left hind." Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He had forgotten the marking. A stupid, fatal oversight. He looked at Vance, calculating the distance. 20 feet. Vance's coat was swept back, his hand hovering near the grip of his Colt. "You are mistaken," Daniel said. Vance pushed off the post. "I don't make mistakes. Hayes, I make a living." The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Then, Vance moved. His hand blurred toward his holster. Daniel did not draw. He threw the burlap sack. The heavy bag, weighted with the whiskey bottle and tinned goods, sailed through the air and struck Vance square in the chest, just as the gun cleared leather. The impact threw the bounty hunter's aim off. The bullet went wide, shattering a window pane in the mercantile behind Daniel. Daniel turned and ran. He bolted down the alleyway, his boots slipping in the muck. He heard Vance shout, a roar of anger, followed by the heavy thud of boots in pursuit. "Stop him!" Vance yelled. $5 to the man who stops him!" Men surged out of the saloons, confused but eager for coins. Daniel lowered his shoulder and slammed into a miner who blocked his path, sending the man sprawling into a pile of crates. He scrambled over a fence, tearing his trousers on a nail. He reached the livery. The stable boy was gone. Blue was tossing his head. Sensing the panic, Daniel slashed the lead rope with his knife. He vaulted into the saddle just as Vance rounded the corner of the stable. Vance dropped to one knee, leveling his pistol. Daniel kicked Blue hard. The horse reared, spinning, acting as a shield. A shot cracked. Daniel felt a sudden, searing burn across his upper arm, as if a hot poker had been dragged across his skin. He gritted his teeth, suppressing a scream, and spurred the horse into a gallop. They tore out of the camp, scattering chickens and pedestrians. Another shot whined past his ear, close enough to hear the displacement of air. Then they were in the scrub, the horse's hooves eating up the ground. Daniel did not stop. He rode hard, taking a circuitous route, doubling back through dry washes and over rocky ridges to lose any trail. He rode until the sun was gone and the moon was high, until Blue was lathered and trembling. When he finally reached the fissure leading to the hidden canyon, he nearly fell out of the saddle. His left sleeve was soaked in blood, stiff and black in the moonlight. He stumbled up the path to the cave. Naylin met him at the entrance. She had been waiting, a knife in her hand. When she saw him, the knife clattered to the stone floor. Daniel, she was on him, her hands searching, frantic. She saw the blood. You are hurt. They found you. It is a scratch, Daniel lied, leaning heavily against the canyon wall. I got the medicine. He slid down to a sitting position. The world was tilting slightly to the left. Naylin worked with a terrifying focus. She cut away his shirt. The bullet had tracked across the deltoid muscle, carving a deep furrow but missing the bone and the artery. It was ugly, but not fatal. She cleaned it with water from the spring and packed it with a poultice of yarrow she had gathered. Her hands were shaking. I sent you, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. I sent you into the wolf's mouth because I was weak, because I wanted comfort. Daniel reached out with his good hand. He took her chin, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a panic he had never seen there before. Not when the barn burned, not when the flood came. This was the panic of a woman who realized she had something to lose. Stop, he rasped. He winced as she tightened the bandage. Look at me. Naylin. She met his gaze. I would ride into hell for a bottle of whiskey if you asked for it. He said, I would fight a legion of devils for a clean cloth. He pulled her hand to his lips. This was always worth it. Do you hear me? You are worth the blood. Naylin stared at him, the tears spilling over to track through the dust on her cheeks. She let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed against his chest. Careful of the wound. We are not safe, she murmured. We are alive, Daniel corrected, and we have the medicine. Later that night, after the pain had dulled to a throbbing ache and the fire had burned down to embers, they lay together on the pine boughs. The baby kicked, a strong, rhythmic movement against Daniel's side. Naylin placed her hand over his. Aylin, she whispered in the dark. Daniel turned his head. Aylin? It is a name, she said, from the old stories. It means joy returned after sorrow, or sometimes clear water after a muddy flood. Daniel rolled the name around in his mind. It was soft, yet strong. It sounded like the wind in the canyon. Aylin, he repeated. It is a beautiful name. It is her name, Naylin said with certainty. She will be happy. She will not be sorrowful. Their peace lasted for 3 days. On the 4th morning, the wind changed. It brought the scent of wood smoke from the valley floor, not the clean smoke of a campfire, but the heavy, oily smoke of something large burning. Naylin stood at the mouth of the cave, sniffing the air. Her body went rigid. They are here, she said. Daniel joined her, his arm in a sling. He looked down the canyon, but the twisting walls hid the view. Who? The riders. They extinguished their fire. They moved with silent urgency, packing the meager supplies they could carry. But before they could retreat deeper into the impossible terrain of the upper peaks, a sound drifted up from the valley below. It was a voice, a child's voice, high, thin, and terrified. And it was screaming a name. Ishkene, Mother! Naylin gasped. The color drained from her face, leaving it ash gray. She grabbed the stone ledge, her knuckles white. Daniel looked at her. What is it? That is not my son, she whispered, her voice trembling. My son is dead, but that voice, that is Goyakla's boy, from my sister's clan. The scream came again, echoing off the canyon walls. Amplified by the acoustics of the stone, it was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. They have a child, Daniel realized, a cold horror settling in his gut. They are using a child to call you. Vance. It had to be Vance. He knew the Apache heart. He knew they would not leave one of their own to be butchered. We have to go, Daniel said, grabbing her arm. Naylin, we have to go up. We cannot save him. It is a trap. Naylin pulled away. She turned to him, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that frightened him. "I left one child in the ground. Daniel, I will not leave another to the wolves. If I run now, I am not Apache. I am not a mother. I am nothing." She moved toward the path leading down. Daniel stepped in front of her. "You cannot go down there. You are heavy with children. You cannot fight." "Then I will die trying," she snarled. Daniel looked at her. He saw the immovability of the mountain in her stance. She would go. She would walk straight into their guns rather than turn her back on that scream. He sighed, a sharp exhale of resignation and resolve. "Wait," he said. He gripped her shoulders. "If you go down there, they will kill you both. You know this." She said nothing, but her chin quivered. "We need a diversion," Daniel said. "We need to make them look away." He looked out toward the valley, toward the direction of his old homestead. The scream had come from that direction. They were camped at the farm. "They are at the house," Daniel said, "or what's left of it." He formulated the plan in seconds. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was the only hand they had to play. "I will draw them out," Daniel said. "I will give them a fire they cannot ignore. When they move to the flames, you cut the boy loose, but your arm?" Nayland started. "My legs are fine," Daniel said grimly. They moved under the cover of darkness. The moon was obscured by clouds, aiding their descent. They crept toward the old homestead, moving like ghosts through the brush. When they reached the perimeter, Daniel saw them. There were 6 men. Vance was there, sitting on a crate by a large fire. Cobb was there too, drinking from a flask. They had set up camp in the shell of the barn. The fire in Part 4 had taken the roof and the loft, but the thick timber frame and the lower walls still stood, blackened and stubborn. They had draped canvas over the scorched beams to create a shelter and piled hay inside for their horses. Tied to the old fence post, alone in the dark, was a small boy. He looked to be no more than 6 years old. He was slumped over, exhausted from screaming, shivering in the night air. Daniel squeezed Nayland's hand. "Wait for the signal," he whispered. He left her in the mesquite and circled wide. He moved toward the back of the barn, where the men had stacked their supplies, crates of ammunition, dry goods, and a barrel of kerosene for their lanterns. Daniel's heart was thudding so hard he thought it would vibrate through the ground. He was one man, injured, against 6. He reached the rear wall of the barn structure. Through the gaps in the charred wood, he could see the men laughing. Cobb was boasting about what he would do when he caught the squaw. Daniel took a deep breath. He uncorked the small flask of whiskey he had kept in his pocket, the one thing he hadn't thrown at Vance. He poured it over a pile of dry tumbleweeds pushed up against the base of the canvas wall. He struck a match. The flame caught instantly. The dry brush flared, the fire licking up the canvas with a hungry roar. "Fire!" one of the men shouted, the horses inside panic-stricken. Kicking at the stalls, the men jumped up, scrambling. "Now!" Daniel screamed in his mind. The kerosene barrel inside the structure caught the heat. It didn't explode, but the wood around it ignited with ferocious speed. The hay they had brought for the horses went up like kindling. The entire camp became a sudden, chaotic inferno. Daniel sprinted toward the fence line, away from Nayland's position, firing his Winchester into the air. "Over here," he yelled. "Come and get me, you bastards!" It worked. The men, disoriented by the sudden blaze and the gunfire, turned toward him. "There he is!" Vance shouted. "Get him!" Bullets chewed up the dirt around Daniel's feet. He ran toward the canyon mouth, limping slightly, his bad arm throbbing. Behind him, he saw a shadow detach itself from the darkness. Nayland moved like water. She reached the boy. The knife flashed. Daniel reached the cover of the rocks just as a bullet slammed into his right thigh. The impact spun him around. He hit the ground hard, biting his tongue. The pain was blinding, a hot spike driving through his leg. He gasped, dragging himself behind a boulder. He checked the wound. Through and through, it had missed the artery, but the muscle was shredded. He couldn't run. He looked back. Nayland had the boy. She was running toward the canyon, dragging the child, but one of the men, a deputy Daniel didn't recognize, had spotted her. He cut her off. The man raised his rifle to club her. Nayland didn't stop. She didn't scream. As the man swung the rifle butt, she ducked, a movement born of pure instinct. She came up with a rock in her hand, a heavy, jagged piece of river stone. She brought it down on the man's face with a sickening crunch. The man dropped like a sack of grain. Nayland scooped up the boy, throwing him onto her hip despite her own burden, and scrambled into the darkness of the canyon. Daniel laid down covering fire, working the lever of his Winchester until the barrel was hot enough to blister his skin. He pinned the remaining men down behind the burning wreckage of the barn. "Go!" he shouted to the dark. "Go!" He dragged himself backward, deeper into the rocks, leaving a trail of blood on the sandstone. They escaped, not by skill, but by the sheer chaos of the night. The posse was too busy trying to save their horses and their supplies from the fire to pursue them immediately into the treacherous dark of the canyon. They moved for hours. Nayland supported Daniel, her shoulder under his good arm. The boy, mute with trauma, clung to Nayland's skirt, moving with a mechanical endurance. They found a narrow crevice high in the canyon wall, miles from the cave, miles from the farm. It was a coyote den, barely large enough for the three of them. They collapsed inside. Daniel was burning up. The fever had set in with terrifying speed. His leg was a mess of blood and torn trousers. Nayland bound it tight with the last of the cotton cloth, her face set in a grim mask. The boy sat in the corner, his knees pulled to his chest. He watched Nayland with wide, worshipful eyes. He did not speak. He did not cry. He simply watched her, as if she were a deity who had walked out of the fire to save him. Nayland pulled Daniel's head into her lap. She stroked his forehead, her fingers cool. "Rest now," she whispered. "The water covers our tracks." Daniel closed his eyes. The pain was distant now, floating somewhere outside his body. He felt light. The darkness took him. He dreamed. He was back at the farm, but it was not the ruin of ash and bone. It was whole. The corn was high and green, rustling in a gentle wind. The house was painted white, the windows shining with reflected sun. Sarah was standing on the porch. She looked exactly as he remembered her on the day they were married. She wore her blue dress, the one with the lace collar. Her hair was pinned up, golden and bright. She was smiling. It was not a sad smile. It was radiant. Daniel walked toward her. He looked down at his hands. They were clean. No blood, no ash. "Sarah," he said, I tried to hold on." She shook her head gently. She stepped off the porch and walked to him. She placed a hand on his cheek. "You held on to the wrong things for a long time." "Daniel," she said. Her voice was like the sound of the creek in spring. She looked past him, toward the mountains, where Nayland and the unborn child waited. "You gave it away," Sarah said. "You gave the love you had for me to them. That is what it was for. It was a seed, Daniel, not a stone." She leaned in and kissed his forehead. It felt like cool rain. "You've done right," she whispered. "You've done right." Daniel watched her turn and walk back into the house. She did not close the door. She left it open. He woke to the sound of Nayland singing softly in Apache. It was a lullaby. He opened his eyes. The fever had broken. The pain in his leg was sharp and real, anchoring him to the earth. The boy was asleep, curled against Nayland's side. Nayland was looking down at Daniel, her hand resting on her stomach. "You came back," she said softly. Daniel looked at the stone ceiling of their shelter. "I had permission," he rasped, his throat dry as dust. He reached out and took her hand. "I am here." Nayland squeezed his fingers. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was touching the peaks. The night was over. They were battered, bleeding, and hunted. But as Daniel looked at the woman and the child, and the second child growing within her, he knew the truth. They were a family, and a family was a fortress that no fire could burn down. The pain arrived with the setting of the moon. a deep, grinding pressure that seized Nolan's lower back and refused to let go. It was not the sharp, sudden violence of a bullet or a knife, but the ancient, tidal force of life demanding to be let in. The cave was warm, heated by a fire of smokeless juniper wood Daniel had gathered. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, a lonely, searching sound that battered against the stone wall they had built for shelter. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sage and the metallic tang of anticipation. Daniel was terrified. He tried to hide it. He moved around the small space with a frantic energy, checking the water skins, stirring the fire, adjusting the blankets. But Nayland saw it in his hands. They were trembling. She saw it in his eyes, a wide, white-rimmed fear that looked backward, not forward. He was not seeing her. He was seeing Sarah. He was seeing the blood-soaked sheets of a farmhouse bedroom 2 years ago. He was seeing death where there should be life. "Daniel," Nayland said. Her voice was tight, strained by a contraction that hardened her belly into stone. He rushed to her side, dropping the cloth he had been holding. "I am here. Is it time? Do you need water?" Nayland reached out and gripped his wrist. Her fingers were like iron bands. "Look at me," she commanded. He looked at her, but his gaze skittered away, drawn to the swell of her abdomen as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "Daniel," she said sharper this time. "I am not her." The words hit him like a slap. He froze. He looked up, forcing his eyes to meet hers. In the firelight, Nayland's face was slick with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead, but her eyes were clear. They were fierce. "I am not a ghost," she whispered, riding out the wave of pain. "And this child is not a memory. You must be here. You must be present if you are walking with the dead. You cannot help the living." Daniel took a shuddering breath. He closed his eyes for a second, and she could see the struggle playing out across his face, the battle to shove the trauma of the past back into its dark box. When he opened his eyes again, the frantic terror had receded, replaced by a grim, steady resolve. He nodded. "I am here. Good." Nayland gasped as the pain peaked. "Now, hold me." The labor was long. It was a brutal, physical ordeal that stripped away time and dignity, leaving only the raw mechanics of the body. Nayland did not scream. She groaned, low guttural sounds that vibrated in her chest, animal and ancient. She paced the stone floor until her legs gave out. Then she crouched, relying on gravity and will. Daniel was useless at first, his hands hovering, unsure where to touch her, but as the hours stretched on and the night deepened, he found his rhythm. He became her anchor. When she felt she was drifting away on a sea of agony, his voice pulled her back. "Breathe, Nalin. That's it. You are strong. You are the strongest thing I know." He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He supported her weight when she squatted, his arms shaking with the effort but never letting her fall. He let her squeeze his hand until he thought the bones would snap, and he never flinched. Toward dawn, the rhythm changed. The pain moved from a dull ache to a tearing pressure. Nayland let out a cry, sharp and high. "It is coming," she panted. "The head." Daniel moved to position himself. He saw the crown of the baby's head, dark with hair. His heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of pure adrenaline. "Push," he whispered. "Push, Nalin." She bore down. The veins in her neck stood out like cords. She gripped his shoulders, her fingernails digging into his flesh. One final, earth-shattering effort, and the baby slipped into the world. Daniel caught the child. His hands, calloused from the plow and the rifle, were suddenly gentle, cradling the slick, warm weight of new life. For a second, there was silence. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. The fire popped. Then, a wail tore through the cave. It was a loud, indignant cry, a demand to be heard. It was the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard. "It's a girl," he choked out, tears streaming freely down his beard. "Nalin, it's a girl." He wrapped the infant in the soft deerskin blanket Nayland had sewn months ago. He cleaned her face gently. She was red and wrinkled, furious at the cold air. But she was healthy. Her eyes, when she blinked them open, were dark and searching. She had Nalen's mouth. She had the rich copper tone of the Apache bloodline, but something in the set of her jaw was all Daniel. He handed her to Nalen. Nalen took the baby. Her exhaustion seemed to evaporate, replaced by a luminous, terrifying love. She ran her thumb over the baby's cheek. She counted the fingers. She pressed her nose against the infant's head, inhaling the scent of birth and blood and iron. She looked up at Daniel. Her eyes were wet. "She is not silent," Nalen whispered. "She has a voice like thunder." Daniel sat back on his heels, his chest heaving with relief. He felt lightheaded, as if he had run 100 miles. "What do we call her?" he asked. Nalen kissed the baby's forehead. "Aylin," she said. Joy returned. "Aylin," Daniel repeated. From the corner of the cave, a shadow moved. The Apache boy, who had sat curled in a ball with his hands over his ears during the worst of the labor, crept forward. He was small for his age, his ribs showing through his thin skin, his eyes large and haunted. He had not spoken a word since the night at the burning barn. He moved like a stray dog expecting a kick. He stopped a few feet away, staring at the bundle in Nalen's arms. "Come," Nalen said softly, extending a hand to him. "Look." The boy hesitated, glancing at Daniel. Daniel nodded encouragingly. The boy stepped closer. He peered over the edge of the blanket. He looked at the baby's scrunched face, at her tiny, flailing fists. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out one dirty finger and touched the baby's hand. Aylin's fingers curled around him instantly, gripping him with surprising strength. The boy's eyes went wide. He looked at Nalen, and for the first time, the mask of trauma slipped. A small, fragile wonder broke through. He did not smile, but his shoulders dropped. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. "She is your sister now," Nalen told him in Apache. "You must watch over her." The boy nodded, solemn, seriously. A guardian appointed by the blood of survival. The sun rose over the canyon rim, sending a shaft of golden light through the cave entrance. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, turning the simple stone shelter into a cathedral. Daniel looked at them. The woman, the baby, the mute boy. He had lost a farm. He had lost his standing in the town. He had lost the life he thought he was supposed to lead. But sitting there on the hard stone floor, covered in sweat and ash, Daniel Hayes knew he was the richest man in the territory. The weeks that followed were a blur of survival and wonder. The canyon was their universe. It was a hard place, unforgiving to the careless, but generous to those who knew how to ask. The spring provided water, sweet and cold. The cliffs provided shelter. The valley floor, though rocky, had patches of soil that had gathered over centuries of floods. Daniel went to work. He could not farm as he had in the lowlands. There were no plows here, no mules. There was only a digging stick and his own back. He cleared a patch of ground near the stream, moving rocks until his hands were raw. He planted the seeds he had carried in his pockets during their flight. Corn, beans, squash. The three sisters. The Apache boy watched him. For the first week, the boy sat on a boulder, whittling a stick, observing Daniel with dark, unreadable eyes. He was like a wild animal, wary of sudden movements. One morning, as Daniel was hoeing the earth, his bad leg gave out. The bullet wound had healed into a puckered, ugly scar, but the muscle was shortened, and after hours of labor, it trembled and failed. He stumbled, dropping the hoe. He cursed softly, rubbing his thigh. He heard a scuff of sandals on stone. The boy was standing there. He picked up the hoe. It was too big for him, the handle awkward in his small hands. Daniel watched, staying still. The boy looked at the ground, then at Daniel. He swung the hoe. It hit the dirt with a clumsy thud. He swung it again, finding a rhythm. Daniel smiled. "Like this," he said gently. He stood up and took the hoe back, demonstrating the motion. "Let the weight do the work. Don't fight the dirt." He handed the tool back. The boy tried again. Better. They worked side by side for the rest of the morning. They did not speak. They did not need to. The rhythm of the work was a language of its own. The strike of the metal, the turn of the earth, the smell of the soil. By noon, the boy was sweating, his face streaked with dirt. He looked at the rows they had cleared. He looked at Daniel. And then he did something he hadn't done since Nolan pulled him from the fire. He pointed to the bag of seeds. Daniel handed him the pouch. "You put them in," Daniel said. "2 seeds for the worms, 2 for the crows, and 1 for us." The boy knelt and began to plant. As the months passed, the seasons shifted. The biting cold of winter melted away, replaced by the gentle warmth of spring. The gray rock of the canyon burst into color. Mexican gold poppies carpeted the slopes in blinding yellow. Penstemons shot up like spikes of fire. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a vibrant, singing green. They lived like ghosts. They saw no one. Occasionally, Daniel would spot a distant figure on the canyon rim, a scout, or perhaps another renegade Apache, but they remained hidden. They left no trails. They lit no large fires during the day. To the world below, Daniel Hayes and the Apache woman were dead. They were a story told in saloons, a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing the racial divide. But in the canyon, they were alive. Aylin grew. She was a happy baby, fat on her mother's milk, her eyes taking in the world with an intense curiosity. She spent her days strapped to a cradle board Naylin had woven from willow, watching the leaves dance in the wind. Naylin healed. The gauntness of her face filled out. Her strength returned, fierce and capable. She wove baskets, gathered herbs, and tanned the hides of the deer Daniel hunted. And Daniel changed. The hardness that had defined him since Sarah's death softened. He laughed more. He sat by the fire in the evenings, whittling toys for Aylin and the boy, whom they had begun to call Little Hawk. For his sharp eyes, he told them stories, not of the Bible or the history books, but of the land. He told them about the way the corn grew, about the patience of the river, about the strength of the stone. The love between him and Naylin deepened, rooting itself into the bedrock of their lives. It was not the frantic, desperate passion of their flight. It was a steady, burning coal. It was in the way she touched his shoulder when he was tired. It was in the way he looked at her across the firelight, seeing not just a woman, but his partner, his equal, his soul. One afternoon in late spring, the air was sweet with the scent of blooming cliff rose. The sun was dipping low, painting the canyon walls in shades of violet and blood orange. Daniel stood by the stream, washing the dirt from his hands. Naylin was sitting on a flat rock nearby, nursing Aylin. The baby's hand rested on her breast, kneading the skin contentedly. Daniel watched them. The image struck him with such force that he had to look away for a moment. It was a picture of everything he had ever wanted, everything he had been told he could not have. He walked over to her. He dried his hands on his trousers. Naylin looked up, sensing his mood. "What is it?" Daniel sat down beside her. He picked up a stone from the ground, a piece of red jasper, smooth and cool. "I've been thinking," he said. "About corn?" she asked, smiling slightly. "You worry about the corn too much. It will grow. Not about the corn." He turned the stone over in his fingers. "I was raised to believe that a man and a woman are not truly joined until a preacher says the words and writes it in a book. I was raised to believe that paper makes it real." Naylin watched him, her expression softening. "But I look at you," Daniel continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I look at our daughter. I look at the boy planting seeds in the dirt, and I know that the paper is nothing. The paper burns. The ink fades." He looked into her eyes. "I want to marry you, Naylin. Not like the towns do. I don't want a church with walls that shut out the sky. I don't want a preacher who doesn't know our names." He held up the red stone. "I want to marry you with the sky and the earth as witnesses. I want to promise myself to you before the mountains, because they are the only things that last as long as I want to love you." Naylin stared at him. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over to track down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. "You are already my husband," she whispered. "You walked through the fire for me. You walked through the water." "I want to say the words," Daniel insisted. "I want the wind to hear them." Naylin nodded, a smile breaking through her tears like the sun through rain. "Then say them." They stood up. Naylin adjusted Aylin in her arms. Daniel took his knife and the red stone. He sat by the stream and worked for hours, grinding and carving. Naylin found a piece of turquoise she had carried from the ruins of her village. They made rings. They were not perfect circles of gold. They were rough, polished stone, shaped by hand and patience. Daniel's was turquoise, the color of the sky. Naylin's was jasper, the color of the earth. At sunset, they stood on the ledge overlooking their small valley. The boy, Little Hawk, stood beside them, holding a feather he had found. He sensed the solemnity of the moment. Daniel took Naylin's hand. He slid the red ring onto her finger. Daniel, take you." "Naylin," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. "To be my breath, to be my shelter, to be the mother of my children and the keeper of my heart. I promise to stand between you and the dark. I promise to grow old beside you. I promise this until the mountains crumble and the stars forget to rise." Naylin's hand trembled as she took the turquoise ring. She slid it onto his thick, scarred finger. Naylin, take you, Daniel, to be my strength, to be my rest, to be the father of my joy. I promise to walk with you where the path leads. I promise to hold you when the wind is cold. I promise this until the rivers run dry and the sun sleeps forever." They kissed. It was a seal set upon their souls. The wind brushed past them, carrying their vows up to the high peaks, where they would be kept safe forever. The final scene of their story did not happen with a gunfight or a dramatic escape. It happened on a Tuesday morning. 3 years later. The canyon was lush. The corn was tall, rustling with dry whispers. The bean vines curled around the stalks, heavy with pods. Daniel walked out to the field. He limped slightly, the old wound stiff in the morning chill, but his back was straight. He wore buckskin trousers and a shirt Naylin had sewn. In his arms, he held Aylin. She was 3 years old now, a ball of energy with wild black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She was pointing at a hawk circling high above. "Bird!" she shouted. "Papa, bird!" "Yes," Daniel said, laughing. "That is a hawk. He is watching us, behind them, trailing in Daniel's wake." Was Little Hawk. He was taller now, his limbs wiry and strong. He carried a small basket of peppers he had picked. He was no longer mute. He was humming a song, a mixture of an old Apache tune and a hymn Daniel had hummed while shaving. Daniel stopped at the edge of the field. He looked at the corn, green and thriving against the red rock. He looked at the boy, who stopped to examine a lizard. He looked at the child in his arms, who leaned her head against his shoulder with total trust. He turned back toward the cave. Naylin was standing in the doorway of the small stone cabin they had built beneath the overhang. The morning light hit her face, turning her skin to gold. She was watching them. She looked at the man who had given up his race, his religion, and his safety for her. She looked at the children who played in the dirt where death had once walked. She leaned against the doorframe, a profound peace settling over her like a warm blanket. The wind stirred her hair. She spoke, her voice a whisper that drifted down the canyon, carried on the breeze that smelled of sage and damp earth. "I wanted a child," she said to the silence, "but I was given a family. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I want a child from you." The Apache woman whispered. "The farmer nearly dropped his tools. It has been a journey of survival, heartbreak, and the enduring power of love to grow in even the stoniest soil. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below letting me know where you are listening from. I am always amazed to see how far these stories travel." If you enjoyed Daniel and Naylin's journey, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. And feel free to share your thoughts on the ending in English. Did their escape satisfy you? What did you think of their vows? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.